Selamat pagi dan salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Distinguished guests, Ms. Pratikma Divki, Regional Director Carbon Disclosure Project, Hong Kong and CDP Team, Bapak Ridwan Kurniawan, Program Manager of PACT Program, Kedutaan Besar United Kingdom, Ibu Catherine Grace, Ketua Umum Indonesia Corporate Secretary Association, beserta dengan tim, Ibu Lani Haryanti, ASEAN Regional Program Manager, Global Reporting Initiative, Bapak Henry Julius Wijaya, Indonesia Country Program Manager, Global Reporting Initiative, Bapak Adi Pratomo Arianto, Kepala Divisi Penilaian Perusahaan 1 PT Bursa Efek Indonesia, para pembicara hari ini, serta Ibu dan Bapak peserta perwakilan dari Perusahaan Tercatat. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Saya Kinanti akan bertindak sebagai MC untuk seminar hari ini. Selamat datang dalam Beginner Seminar Introduction to TCFD and SDGs pada hari kedua. Terima kasih kami ucapkan kepada para peserta dan selamat bergabung dalam acara webinar ini yang diselenggarakan pada hari Kamis 3 Juni 2021. Acara ini merupakan rangkaian webinar kerjasama PT Bursa Efek Indonesia dengan Global Reporting Initiative dan turut didukung oleh Carbon Disclosure Project, UK Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transition, Kementerian Perencanaan Pembangunan Nasional atau BAPPENAS, dan Indonesia Corporate Secretary Association. Para hadirin yang kami hormati, untuk memulai acara, kami akan mengundang Kepala Divisi Penilaian Perusahaan 1 PT Bursa Efek Indonesia untuk menyampaikan sambutan pembuka. Kepada Bapak Adi Pratomo Arianto, kami persilahkan.
Thank you, Mbak Kinanti. Distinguished guests, Ibu Pratikma Divki, Regional Director Carbon Disclosure Project Hong Kong and Team, Bapak Ridwan Kurniawan, Program Manager of PACT Program Kedutaan Besar United Kingdom, Ibu Catherine Grace, Ketua Umum Indonesia Corporate Secretary Association, beserta dengan tim, Ibu Lani Haryanti, Regional Program Manager ASEAN Global Reporting Initiative, Bapak Henry Julius Wijaya, Country Program Manager Global Reporting Initiative, dan Ibu dan Bapak peserta perwakilan dari Perusahaan Tercatat. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning. First of all, let us praise thanks to God Almighty for the abundance of grace and joy, so all of us can still gather in this webinar in good health. And on behalf of Indonesia Stock Exchange, I would like to say thank you to Global Reporting Initiative team for your continuous support to Indonesia Capital Market, as well as to Carbon Disclosure Project, UK Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transition, Kementerian Perencanaan Pembangunan Nasional, and Indonesia Corporate Secretary Association to be here with us and support series of webinar to support the awareness of ESG in Indonesia Capital Market. This series of webinar also all the speakers today will share more in-depth knowledge and provide more comprehensive information regarding sustainable development goals and task force on climate-related financial disclosure to Indonesia-listed companies. I believe it will be a fruitful webinar and very beneficial for our capital market. Next, please allow me to present my speech in Bahasa. Ibu dan Bapak yang kami hormati, kami ucapkan terima kasih atas kesediaannya untuk mengikuti webinar hari kedua dengan topik Beginner Seminar Introduction to TCFD and SDGs dalam rangkaian webinar yang diselenggarakan atas kerjasama PT Bursa Efek Indonesia dan Global Reporting Initiative, serta didukung oleh CDP, UK PACT, BAPPENAS, dan ICSA sebagai bentuk layanan kepada perusahaan tercatat untuk memberikan capacity building secara berkelanjutan mengenai aspek ESG untuk mendukung pelaporan keberlanjutan perusahaan tercatat. Rangkaian acara yang sedang dilaksanakan saat ini, yaitu pada tanggal 2 sampai 3 Juni serta 29 sampai 30 Juni 2021, telah dirancang khusus bagi perusahaan tercatat dalam rangka meningkatkan pemahaman mengenai SDGs dan pengungkapan risiko keuangan terkait iklim yang diharapkan dapat membantu dalam pelaporan Sustainability Report oleh perusahaan tercatat sesuai dengan Peraturan Otoritas Jasa Keuangan Nomor 51 PUJK 03/2017 terkait penerapan keuangan berkelanjutan bagi lembaga jasa keuangan emiten, dan perusahaan publik yang secara bertahap dilaporkan sejak tahun 2020. Hadirin yang kami hormati, topik hari ini akan lebih difokuskan pada pengenalan TCFD atau Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosure yang merupakan salah satu standar dan acuan rekomendasi dalam penyampaian aspek ESG, khususnya terkait pengelolaan dan pengungkapan risiko penting terkait perubahan iklim. Isu perubahan iklim sudah menjadi concern seluruh dunia termasuk Indonesia karena dampak yang signifikan dapat dirasakan oleh seluruh pihak. Sehingga pelaporan atas hal tersebut yang terstandarisasi sesuai standar internasional menjadi perhatian seluruh pihak, khususnya para investor global. Rekomendasi TCFD juga dapat membantu pelaku bisnis dalam menganalisis risiko dan peluang yang muncul dalam bisnisnya karena perubahan iklim, dan merefleksikannya dalam strategi manajemen, serta menjabarkan semua informasi tentang dampak finansial yang terkait. IDX juga berkomitmen untuk turut mendukung pelaporan hal tersebut yang termasuk dalam pelaporan aspek environment, social, and governance dari pelaku bisnis, agar dapat turut berkontribusi pada pelambatan perubahan iklim di dunia. Hal ini juga sejalan dengan roadmap keuangan berkelanjutan fase 2, yaitu di 2021 sampai 2025 yang diterbitkan oleh OJK, yang diharapkan pasar modal Indonesia untuk dapat mencapai keuangan berkelanjutan. Dengan demikian, disclosure dalam Sustainability Report perusahaan tercatat di Indonesia pun akan menjadi lebih baik kualitas data dan informasinya, sehingga dapat lebih terstandarisasi dan digunakan oleh investor lokal maupun global. Bapak dan Ibu yang kami hormati, dengan adanya pemaparan dari narasumber pada pagi hari ini, kami berharap informasi yang disampaikan dapat membantu perusahaan tercatat di Indonesia dalam menyusun dan melaporkan laporan berkelanjutan sesuai dengan ketentuan yang berlaku, serta dapat mengikuti best practice yang ada, sehingga dapat lebih informatif dan bermanfaat bagi seluruh pihak, khususnya para investor. Kami juga percaya seminar ini akan bermanfaat untuk perusahaan tercatat dalam menerapkan aspek ESG dan pelaporan untuk kedepannya. Akhir kata, kami mengucapkan selamat mengikuti seminar hari ini. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih kepada Bapak Adi Pratomo Arianto atas sambutannya. Hadirin yang kami hormati, agenda selanjutnya adalah sambutan dari Ketua Umum Indonesia Corporate Secretary Association. Oleh karena itu, kepada Ibu Catherine Grace, kami persilahkan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Yang saya hormati Bapak Adi Pratomo Arianto, Kepala Divisi Penilaian Perusahaan 1, Bursa Efek Indonesia. Distinguished guest, Mrs. Pratima Divki, Regional Director, Carbon Disclosure Project Hong Kong, CDP. Mr. Frederick Anderson, Regional Corporate Engagement Lead, Carbon Disclosure Project Hong Kong, CDP. Bapak Ridwan Kurniawan, Program Manager of UK Partnering for Accelerate Climate Transition, UKP. Juga yang saya hormati, Ibu Lani Haryanti dari GRI, Bapak Henry Julius juga dari GRI. Berikut juga yang saya hormati Bapak Ibu sekalian peserta yang hadir pada seminar pada pagi hari ini. Mari kita panjatkan puji dan syukur kepada Tuhan Yang Maha Esa karena berkat karunia serta ridho-Nya kita dapat hadir di acara pada pagi hari ini. Izinkan saya, Mariati, mewakili Ibu Catherine Grace yang mohon maaf saat ini tidak bisa hadir untuk memberikan sambutan. Kami ingin memberikan sambutan mewakili Asosiasi Corporate Secretary Association. Bapak Ibu sekalian, seminar terkait dengan pelaporan aspek-aspek keberlanjutan atau Sustainability dan SDGs yang telah diselenggarakan sejak tanggal 2 Juni 2021 kemarin menjadi pendukung langkah-langkah penerapan Peraturan Otoritas Jasa Keuangan yaitu POJK 51/2017 bagi perusahaan tercatat untuk menerbitkan laporan berkelanjutan perusahaan. ICSA dalam hal ini bekerja sama dengan Bursa Efek Indonesia, UKP, dan BAPPENAS berkolaborasi memberikan dukungan kepada GRI dan CDP dalam penyelenggaraan rangkaian seminar GRI-CDP, di mana seminar ini bertujuan untuk memberikan pemahaman mengenai sustainability business dan bagaimana memberikan pemahaman membuat suatu laporan sustainability dengan berbagai framework pengungkapan, yaitu seperti TCFD, standar GRI, dan SDGs, serta bagaimana menyelaraskannya dengan POJK nomor 51/2017. Bapak Ibu sekalian, ICSA juga mendorong anggotanya untuk dapat mengikuti rangkaian seminar ini dengan harapan dapat membantu para corporate secretary di perusahaannya masing-masing membuat laporan sustainability sampai dengan memiliki pemahaman dalam pembuatan target dan action plan SDGs di perusahaan. Untuk lebih memberikan pemahaman serta teknis dalam pembuatan sustainability report tersebut, kami ICSA bersama dengan GRI juga akan membuat rangkaian coaching session yang nantinya akan diberikan kepada seminar yang mengikuti seminar pada training hari ini, yang nantinya mungkin akan mendaftar. Lebih lanjut, izinkan kami untuk memperkenalkan lebih jauh terkait ICSA. Silakan. Next. Bapak Ibu sekalian, fungsi Sekretaris Perusahaan didasari oleh POJK 35 2014 tentang Sekretaris Perusahaan Emiten atau Perusahaan Publik dalam rangka mendorong kinerja emiten serta diperlukannya penerapan tata kelola yang baik dalam perusahaan publik, maka emiten wajib memiliki fungsi Sekretaris Perusahaan. Bapak Ibu sekalian, Sekretaris Perusahaan memiliki tugas dan tanggung jawab untuk mengikuti perkembangan pasar modal, memberikan masukan kepada direksi dan Dewan Komisaris Emiten untuk memenuhi ketentuan peraturan perundang-undangan di pasar modal, membantu direksi dan Dewan Komisaris dalam pelaksanaan tata kelola perusahaan, serta sebagai penghubung antara emiten dengan pemegang saham, otoritas jasa keuangan, dan pemangku kepentingan lainnya. Selanjutnya, bagi para profesional yang ingin menjadi sekretaris perusahaan, harus memenuhi beberapa persyaratan, yaitu memiliki pengetahuan dan pemahaman dalam bidang hukum, keuangan, dan tata kelola perusahaan. Dalam hal pelaporan dan pengungkapan, emiten juga wajib mengungkapkan uraian singkat terkait pelaksanaan fungsi sekretaris perusahaan dan informasi mengenai pendidikan dan atau pelatihan yang diikuti sekretaris perusahaan melalui laporan tahunan. Oleh karena itu, mengacu kepada peraturan POJK 35 ini, di sini sudah disampaikan tugas dan tanggung jawab sekretaris perusahaan, persyaratan sekretaris perusahaan, pelaporan, dan pengungkapannya. Next. Melihat pentingnya fungsi sekretaris perusahaan bagi emiten, pada tahun 2008, Indonesia Corporate Secretary Association atau ICSA resmi didirikan dengan tujuan untuk meningkatkan profesionalisme sekretaris perusahaan di Indonesia, serta mendukung upaya pengembangan tata kelola perusahaan yang baik melalui pengembangan pengetahuan dan keterampilan, pertukaran informasi, dan forum komunikasi antar sekretaris perusahaan, regulator, dan pemangku kepentingan lainnya. ICSA memposisikan diri sebagai mitra strategis seperti KESAI dan SRO lainnya, regulator, dan asosiasi profesional lainnya di pasar modal untuk mempromosikan tata kelola perusahaan yang baik di Indonesia. Sebagai asosiasi profesi bagi sekretaris perusahaan di Indonesia yang terus berkembang, visi ICSA adalah meletakkan pijakan kuat untuk melaksanakan standarisasi profesi dengan menjadikan ICSA sebagai asosiasi pengembang profesi sekretaris perusahaan Indonesia yang mendorong standar kelola yang baik. Visi ini didukung oleh misi ICSA, yaitu untuk berfokus kepada peletakan standarisasi profesi sekretaris perusahaan, mengembangkan sistem pendidikan dan pelatihan sekretaris perusahaan dengan standar tata kelola internasional, serta mendorong kemajuan pasar modal Indonesia melalui kerjasama dengan regulator dan SRO. Berikutnya, ICSA memiliki peran penting dalam peningkatan pengetahuan corporate secretary di Indonesia, terutama dalam pengimplementasian SDGs pada setiap perusahaan terbuka. ICSA melalui ICSA Academy bekerja sama dengan GRI dalam melakukan pelatihan mengenai sustainability reporting, khususnya bagi para corporate secretary yang di dalamnya mencakup 3 aspek penting dalam keberlanjutan perusahaan, yaitu aspek lingkungan, sosial, dan tata kelola atau ESG. Maka dengan ini diharapkan performa dan nilai perusahaan akan mengalami peningkatan. Di sini ICSA milestone didirikan sejak tahun 2008 dan sudah banyak proses yang kami telah lalui dan kami capai. Di antaranya juga ICSA telah bentuk ICSA Academy yang merupakan wadah edukasi dari ICSA, di mana di sini di dalam wadah edukasi ini kami turut mendorong untuk meningkatkan capacity dari corporate secretary dalam mengimplementasikan SDG di dalam perusahaannya. Next. Di sini kami juga ingin memperkenalkan susunan pengurus dari ICSA yang baru saja terbentuk di 2021 Februari yang lalu, di mana sebagai Ketua Umum adalah Ibu Catherine Grace, Ibu Dea Sidarto sebagai Bendahara Umum, dan saya sendiri sebagai Sekretaris Jenderal, dan didukung oleh para WKU bidang kerjasama kelembagaan, Bapak Tumpal, dan bidang organisasi keanggotaan, Bapak Andrew, Ibu Fajria untuk bidang edukasi, Bapak Dimas bidang standarisasi, dan Ibu Ranti dari bidang pengkajian, serta Ibu Reski bidang hukum, dan Ibu Melinda P bagian bidang komunikasi media dan industri. Selanjutnya. Di bawah ini adalah tim dari anggota di masing-masing WKU. Selanjutnya. Kami menyampaikan program kerja dari ICSA 2021-2024, di mana di bidang kerjasama dan kelembagaan, mewujudkan kerjasama dengan OJK, SRO, Sitifas Academy, lembaga pemerintah swasta, dan mitra strategis ICSA lainnya, dan di bidang organisasi serta keanggotaan, merumuskan kebijakan dan melaksanakan program untuk memberikan manfaat terbaik bagi anggota ICSA. Dan untuk bidang berikutnya, next. Bidang edukasi, seperti tadi sudah disampaikan, bahwa melalui ICSA Academy, ICSA akan menjadi pusat pengembangan kompetensi profesi corporate secretary di Indonesia melalui program pendidikan dan pelatihan yang terstruktur dan komprehensif, yaitu terdiri dari knowledge, skill, dan attitude. Di bidang standarisasi dan profesi, kami memiliki program kerja membentuk rujukan sistem standarisasi bagi profesi corporate secretary. Di bidang pengkajian, melakukan kajian untuk menjadi mitra utama bagi anggota dalam mengkaji peraturan ataupun rancangan peraturan baru yang diterbitkan oleh OJK, SRO, dan pemerintah terkait pasar modal, korporasi, dan juga profesi corporate secretary. Di bidang hubungan internasional, kami mengikuti dan berpartisipasi dalam perkembangan tata kelola internasional, membina serta mengembangkan kerjasama dengan organisasi tata kelola internasional, termasuk mengadakan studi banding, webinar, konferensi berskala internasional, guna mendukung peningkatan profesi corporate secretary di Indonesia. Yang terakhir, bidang komunikasi media dan industri, merancang dan melaksanakan program komunikasi, sosialisasi, dan publikasi informasi bagi internal anggota dan eksternal media partners. Next. Next. Di sini kami ingin menyampaikan bahwa kegiatan-kegiatan yang telah kami laksanakan sejak Maret dan Mei 2021, di mana kami juga telah menyelenggarakan seminar-seminar, salah satunya sebelum periode Maret ini kami juga sebagai bentuk dukungan dalam pembuatan sustainability report, kami telah melaksanakan webinar terkait sustainability report atau SR, bekerja sama dengan GRI juga, dan kami selanjutnya juga melaksanakan coaching session untuk lebih memberikan pemahaman secara teknis dalam pembuatan sustainability report tersebut. Next. Next. Selanjutnya, Bapak Ibu sekalian, dalam waktu dekat ICSA akan segera melaksanakan workshop Corporate Governance CG Officer, yaitu pada tanggal 28 sampai 30 Juni 2021, yang juga terbuka untuk umum. Melalui workshop ini, Bapak Sekretariat diharapkan akan memahami the principle of corporate governance, effective board meeting, shareholders, annual report, dan sustainability reporting, board of directors and commissioners, information disclosure, competency of corporate secretary. Bapak Ibu yang berkenan bisa dapat join di dalam seminar tersebut. Next. Akhir kata, Bapak Ibu sekalian, kami mengucapkan selamat mengikuti seminar pada pagi hari ini. Semoga bermanfaat dan dapat mengikuti seminar-seminar berikutnya. Akhir kata, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih kepada Ibu Mariati Apong yang mewakili ICSA, dan selanjutnya kami ucapkan selamat datang kepada Ibu Catherine Grace, Ketua Umum ICSA. Selamat datang Ibu. Baik, hadirin yang kami hormati.
Ya, selamat. Terima kasih Mbak Kinanti. Saya mohon maaf tadi salah link rupanya. Jadi masuk ke webinar. Jadi saya nunggunya di webinar, ternyata saya harus masuk dalam link yang dikasih oleh Ibu Lani. Jadi mohon maaf tadi agak sedikit bingung, ini masuknya karena ada 2 link.
Ya, baik.
Ya, saya terima kasih kepada Ibu Mar yang sudah menggantikan saya, dan kami dari ICSA sesuai dengan tadi sudah kami paparkan, terima kasih dengan semua pihak yang telah melaksanakan acara ini, yaitu dengan Bursa Efek Indonesia tentunya, dan BAPPENAS, GRI, dan PACT. Saya rasa itu saja, semua penjelasan dari ICSA telah disampaikan oleh Bu Mar. Terima kasih.
Baik, terima kasih sekali Bu Catherine Grace atas pemaparannya. Bapak Ibu yang hadir yang kami hormati, selanjutnya kita akan memasuki sesi pemaparan materi yang akan terbagi menjadi 2 sesi. Di mana sesi pertama akan membahas terkait Introducing TCFD Aligned Reporting yang akan disampaikan oleh CDP Team. Yang pertama adalah Miss Pratima Divki, Regional Director CDP Hong Kong. Yang kedua adalah Mr. Joseph Gualtieri, Senior Project Officer Corporate Engagement CDP Hong Kong. Mr. Frederick Anderson, Regional Corporate Engagement Lead CDP Hong Kong. Miss Ellen Kwok, Senior Project Officer Corporate Engagement CDP Hong Kong. Dan sesi kedua akan membahas sharing good practices from TCFD reporter yang akan disampaikan oleh Mr. Lee Kok Wee dari Wilmar International Limited. Baik, dalam berlangsungnya pemaparan materi tersebut, Bapak dan Ibu dapat langsung menyampaikan pertanyaan pada menu Q&A. Dan moderator acara hari ini yaitu akan dipandu oleh Ibu Rini Setiawati, Project Manager Forest CDP, dan akan memandu Bapak Ibu dalam sesi Q&A tersebut. Kepada Ibu Rini Setiawati, kami persilahkan untuk memulai sesi pertama materi acara hari ini. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Mbak Kinanti. Apakah bisa dengar saya dengan baik? Iya? Oke. Apakah bisa melihat screen saya sekarang?
Sudah bisa Bu Rini.
Oke, baik. Ya, baik, terima kasih. Terima kasih Ibu Kinanti atas pembukaannya, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian. Selamat pagi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Saya start. Oke. Sebelum kita mulai acara berikut merupakan daftar istilah yang akan banyak kita pakai untuk hari ini. Jangan khawatir jika Anda tidak dapat mengingat istilah-istilah ini, kami akan melampirkannya dalam dokumen setelah webinar ini berlangsung. Oke, sebelumnya saya juga ingin mengucapkan terima kasih kepada peserta dan panelis yang telah hadir dalam webinar ini. Secara khusus, kami juga ingin mengucapkan terima kasih kepada Bapak Adi Pratomo Arianto, Kepala Divisi Penilaian Perusahaan 1, PT Bursa Efek Indonesia, dan Ibu Catherine Grace dan Ibu Mariati, Ketua Umum dan Sekretaris Jenderal Indonesia Corporate Secretary Association, yang telah memberikan kata sambutan dan pembukaan untuk acara webinar kita hari ini yang bertajuk Introducing the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Webinar ini bertujuan untuk memberikan wawasan baik kepada perusahaan tercatat maupun institusi keuangan mengenai aksi dan pelaporan lingkungan perusahaan. Webinar kita hari ini juga merupakan webinar pertama dari seri webinar yang akan kami bawakan selama tahun 2021. Webinar ini terselenggara melalui kemitraan dengan GRI atau Global Reporting Initiative. Pada kesempatan ini, saya juga ingin memperkenalkan diri. Nama saya Rini Setiawati. Saat ini saya bekerja sebagai manajer dalam program Hutan CDP dan akan memandu jalannya webinar hari ini. Sebelum kita mulai, ada beberapa hal terkait pelaksanaan webinar yang perlu Anda ketahui. Yang pertama, audio untuk partisipan akan di-mute selama jalannya webinar. Lalu akan terdapat beberapa sesi tanya-jawab, ada 2 sesi tanya-jawab dalam webinar ini. Bagi peserta yang memiliki pertanyaan, silahkan tulis pertanyaan Anda melalui fitur Q&A dan bukan chat box. Selama webinar berlangsung, pertanyaan Anda nanti akan dijawab oleh pemateri baik secara tertulis maupun secara langsung. Webinar ini juga akan direkam, rekaman akan dibagikan kepada peserta yang sudah mendaftar. Rekaman akan tersedia dalam 2 bahasa, yaitu bahasa Indonesia maupun bahasa Inggris. Lalu materi webinar akan dibawakan dalam bahasa Inggris. Terjemahan langsung bahasa Indonesia tersedia bagi peserta yang ingin mendengarkan materi dalam bahasa Indonesia. Bagi Anda yang ingin mengakses terjemahan simultan, Anda dapat mengklik ikon interpretation yang berada di panel bagian bawah layar Anda dan memilih ikon bahasa Indonesia. Silahkan ikuti langkah berikut di layar untuk mengakses fitur interpretasi. Jika Anda tidak ingin mendengarkan suara dari pemateri, Anda dapat mengklik tombol mute original audio yang Anda dapat lihat di layar Anda. Bagi peserta yang menggunakan handphone, Anda juga dapat menggunakan fitur interpretasi yang terdapat pada Zoom di handphone. Instruksi untuk
Hi, sorry, can you not hear Rini?
No, still cannot hear her.
Okay, just a second. You want to use one?
Okay, give me a second.
Baik, Bapak Ibu, mohon maaf dapat menunggu sebentar. Mohon maaf ada kesalahan teknis. Acara akan kami mulai dalam waktu beberapa menit lagi sambil menunggu video dan suara dapat berjalan.
Okay.
Baik. Sudah oke, Bu Rini?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry for the technical glitch. Oke, saya akan tadi saya membahas sedikit mengenai saya akan masuk sedikit ke bahasan utama dan sedikit latar belakang. Jadi proyek peningkatan kapasitas ini dapat terlaksana melalui pendanaan dari Department for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy dari Inggris. Programnya sendiri bernama UK PACT atau Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transition. Program ini merupakan bagian dari komitmen Inggris dalam mengatasi isu-isu perubahan iklim dengan bekerja sama dengan negara-negara partner dan juga organisasi dalam mendukung percepatan transisi ke pertumbuhan bersih. CDP bersama dengan GRI menerima pendanaan dari UK PACT untuk menjalankan program peningkatan kapasitas bagi perusahaan tercatat di Indonesia. terkait dengan praktik terbaik dalam pelaporan informasi lingkungan perusahaan, dalam hal ini penyelarasan dengan TCFD. Sedangkan GRI akan berfokus pada bagaimana perusahaan dapat menyelaraskan tujuan bisnis dan indikator kinerja kunci dengan tujuan pembangunan berkelanjutan atau SDG. Program ini dilaksanakan melalui seri webinar sepanjang tahun 2021. Webinar hari ini merupakan seri pertama dalam webinar seri ini dan akan membahas mengenai pengenalan terhadap konsep-konsep TCFD dan SDGs. Dalam beberapa bulan mendatang, kami akan menyelenggarakan webinar yang akan membahas lebih dalam terkait topik spesifik seperti analisis skenario terkait perubahan iklim dan penilaian risiko perubahan iklim. Untuk melengkapi program ini, kami juga akan menerbitkan beberapa laporan terkait TCFD dalam bahasa Indonesia. Saat ini kami memiliki beberapa materi terkait TCFD dalam bahasa Inggris. Kami akan menerjemahkan materi-materi dan mendiseminasikan ke perusahaan. Kami akan memberikan update mengenai laporan-laporan ini ketika laporan-laporan ini sudah tersedia. Mari kita langsung saja menuju ke dalam acara utama. Berikut merupakan keluaran yang kita harapkan pada akhir webinar ini. Pada akhir acara ini diharapkan peserta dapat lebih mengerti mengenai latar belakang, tujuan, dan struktur dari TCFD. Peserta dapat belajar mengenai panduan dan rekomendasi TCFD, dan juga dapat mengerti mengenai penyelarasan antara rekomendasi TCFD dan proses pelaporan CDP. Peserta dapat mengambil langkah awal dalam mempersiapkan organisasinya dalam mempublikasikan laporan yang selaras dengan TCFD. Selanjutnya, peserta juga diharapkan dapat mengetahui bagaimana mengakses materi-materi terkait TCFD. Terima kasih sekali lagi bagi para peserta dan pembicara yang telah bergabung dalam webinar hari ini. Terima kasih sebesar-besarnya kepada UK PACT Green Recovery Fund dan juga partner kami Global Reporting Initiative, PT Bursa Efek Indonesia, Indonesia Corporate Secretary Association, dan juga Kementerian Perencanaan Pembangunan Nasional atau BAPPENAS yang telah memberikan dukungan dalam pengembangan dan pelaksanaan proyek ini. Untuk
Mohon maaf,
dan juga
Bu
Ibu
Rini.
Catherine Grace. Iya.
Sorry, tadi suaranya sempat hilang, tapi sudah oke lagi, Bu.
Oke.
Ya, thank you, Bu.
Mohon maaf hari ini audionya agak bermasalah. Ya, tadi kita sudah mendengarkan kata sambutan dan pembukaan dari Bapak Adi Pratomo Arianto dan Ibu Catherine Grace dan Ibu Mariati dari ICSA. Materi pertama terkait latar belakang dan kondisi saat ini akan dibawakan oleh Ibu Pratima Divgi. Selanjutnya rekan saya Joseph Gualtieri akan membawakan bahasan mengenai konsep dan komponen dari TCFD. Selanjutnya kita akan ada sesi tanya jawab hanya sedikit sebentar saja, lalu akan diikuti break, mini break. Lalu rekan saya Frederick Anderson akan memfasilitasi bahasan terkait pengembangan peta jalan TCFD melalui pelaporan CDP yang akan diikuti oleh pemateri dari Ibu Elim Kwok yang akan membahas bagaimana perusahaan dapat memulai pelaporan TCFD. Pemaparan dari Elim akan diikuti oleh studi kasus dari dari Wilmar International Limited yang akan diwakili oleh Bapak Lee Kokvi mengenai pengalaman Wilmar dalam mengembangkan pelaporan yang selaras dengan TCFD. Di penghujung acara kita akan memiliki satu sesi tanya jawab terakhir yang akan diikuti oleh penutup. Sebelum kita mulai, saya ingin ingatkan kepada peserta sekalian, bagi Anda yang memiliki pertanyaan, silahkan tulis pertanyaan Anda di kolom Q&A selama acara berlangsung. Kami akan coba jawab pertanyaan tersebut baik secara tertulis, dan jika waktu memungkinkan akan kami jawab secara live. Anda juga dipersilahkan untuk menuliskan pertanyaan Anda dalam bahasa Indonesia. Langsung saja kita masuki materi pertama, yaitu latar belakang dan kondisi saat ini yang akan dibawakan oleh Ibu Pratima Divgi. Pratima, over to you.
Thank you, Rini. Are you able to see me and hear me okay?
Yes.
All good? Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Adi Pratomo Arianto, Ibu Catherine Grace, and Ibu Kinanti Marta for the very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. and very much appreciate your attending today's event.
Fatima, your voice is still missing.
Are you able to hear me now? Hello?
Iya Bu, yes, we can hear you, Bu Miss
You can hear me
Fatima.
now?
Yes,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you. I'll start again. Good morning, everyone, and very much appreciate your attending today's event. I would like to start my session by especially acknowledging the British government, BAPPENAS, the Indonesia Stock Exchange, ICSA, and our fellow colleagues at GRI for giving us the opportunity to develop and facilitate today's workshop. I won't delve into who CDP is, as my colleagues Joe and Fred will cover this in their later sections. They will also touch upon who we are, how we are working with capital markets, financial institutions, and companies in Asia Pacific on matters such as climate change and environment. Over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I will mainly focus on three factors. The first is the urgency for countries and regions to develop climate resilience. The second is what countries are already doing in this regard. And the third is how companies are responding to policy requirements, but also integrating climate strategies in business. As many of you are probably aware, the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 by over 190 nations. And the focus of this agreement is to limit the pace of global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. To achieve this goal, countries commit to taking action through what is commonly known as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And when a country such as Indonesia provides its NDC goals, it specifies the actions that it will take to reduce emissions, but it also provides action plans to develop resilience to climate change. Could I have the next slide, please? Effects of climate change are already being felt globally, and it is now impacting some countries much more than others. This slide shows the countries that have, over the past 19 years, been particularly affected by climate change. 5 out of the 10 most impacted countries are in Asia. It also probably comes as no surprise that more than 75% of global capital stock that could be damaged from riverine flooding in any given year could come from Asia. Today, more than 70 countries are currently working to establish policies for net zero emissions by 2050. Of these, 2 have actually already achieved carbon neutrality, so this shows that this definitely can be done. And 6 countries have incorporated net zero emission targets into legislation. Countries have also begun to mention carbon pricing in their NDCs, and this indicates that they are either planning or considering use of climate markets or domestic carbon pricing to meet their Paris goals. As an example, Singapore has already introduced a carbon tax. The carbon tax is currently low to allow companies to incorporate this within their business. It is set at 5 Singapore dollars per ton of greenhouse gas emissions from 2019 to 2023. And then there are plans to increase this tax between 10 and 15 Singapore dollars per ton of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. In line with the NDC goals, Indonesia has also committed to specific actions on emission reduction and climate change adaptation. The government of Indonesia pledged to reduce emissions by 26% against business as usual by 2020, and the government is already preparing for its next NDC commitments. You may have seen the recent news that Indonesia will not approve any new coal-fired power plants except for the ones that are already under construction or have reached their financial close. Indonesia also plans to offer renewable energy incentives, impose carbon taxes, and develop a carbon trading system as it seeks to cut its emissions from its 2010 baseline. Besides country and national level action, another area of consideration for companies is the financial systems, which are also coming together to understand the risks of climate change in financial portfolios. In 2017, central banks came together to understand these climate-related financial risks. Today, 77 central banks are part of this coalition under the Network for Greening the Financial System. Indonesia's central bank is part of the network, while China's central bank and Singapore's monetary authority are both on the steering committee of this network. You may have seen in Asia Pacific, particularly central banks of China, Malaysia, and Singapore have come out publicly in favor of climate and green finance. Just to give an example, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority in 2020 showcased how climate change is intrinsically linked with existing banking risks. For example, banks could face credit risks on collateralized assets that are impacted by extreme weather events and have a fall in market value. Similar such risks are identified in this paper for businesses that may be affected by drivers of climate change, such as technology, climate policy, and market sentiment. As a result of these central bank guidance, financial institutions have started integrating and financially evaluating climate change issues when investing or providing loans to companies. And companies have started to voluntarily report on climate-related financial risks, but also on low-carbon opportunities. Next slide, please. Regulators and policymakers in Asia Pacific are also moving towards increased disclosure on climate issues that may impact companies. And in this regard, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD framework, has commonly emerged as a gold standard. And the reason for this is really twofold. The TCFD framework provides companies the ability to assess financial impact of climate change on their business operations. It is important to know that these financial impacts may be negative, such as disruption in your normal business activities, but also that these impacts could be positive, for example, through low carbon opportunities or cost savings through resource efficiency. This framework has also enabled companies to integrate climate assessments within their existing business strategy. As you see on the slide, some regions have already started implementing TCFD to enhance disclosure and use of climate information in financial decisions. New Zealand became the first country in the world to mandate TCFD reporting, but recently Malaysia and Hong Kong have both come out publicly in favor of TCFD reporting, and we actually expect other Asian markets to follow over the next couple of years. Companies often ask us, how does TCFD reporting fit within existing ESG and sustainability reporting frameworks? This slide provides a simple, but I think personally, a very effective way to establish the building blocks for corporate reporting. At the bottom left square is financial reporting. All companies are required to report on the financial health of their operations. Building on this are the ESG metrics that financially impact business operations. And this is where the TCFD framework comes in, as it relates to financial reporting of climate risks and opportunities. And overlaying this are the broader ESG metrics, such as the GRI standards, that provide insights on a company's positive and negative contributions to sustainable development. As mentioned earlier, the TCFD framework is a strategy exercise as well. It is also for this reason that the TCFD links very well with a company's enterprise risk management framework. If your company already has a long-term strategy developed for your business, this slide shows how the TCFD framework fits within your existing strategy. Under governance and culture, for example, companies in Asia are now already identifying and reporting which board member and senior management own the climate strategy within their business and are responsible for making business operations resilient to climate change. Likewise, a company's strategy and objectives fit very well with TCFD's climate scenario planning, as it aims to conduct vulnerability assessments and estimating climate-related negative and positive financial impact. Metrics and targets identified under the TCFD fit into a company's performance goals, so companies can assess current targets and consider future revisions to their TCFD roadmap. And finally, the TCFD serves as a standalone report within the organization, but it also becomes a communication tool that you can share with investors and shareholders to demonstrate that your company has, number one, robust procedures to understand the financial impacts of climate change. You have assessed how severe or not these impacts are estimated to be, and the monitoring process that you have in place to mitigate risks and capitalize on business opportunities related to low carbon. With this, I will conclude my session and hope it provided sufficient drawback on the need for developing climate-related business and financial strategies for companies. My colleague, Joseph Gualtieri, will now discuss the various concepts of the TCFD framework and how companies are practically developing climate strategies and reporting through TCFD. Joe, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Pratomo. Hope everyone can hear me, and thank you all for joining us today, and to our co-hosts for making this event possible, and also to our interpreter for helping the CDP team understand the comments that our colleagues in Indonesia have made. So my name is Joe, and I am on CDP's corporate reporting team. And over the next few minutes, I'll briefly introduce the TCFD, and I'll highlight some of the key elements that you'll want to include in your TCFD disclosure. So as Pratomo mentioned, the TCFD has its origins in the Paris Agreement of 2015, in which over 190 countries committed to limiting global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And to that end, G20 finance ministers tasked the Financial Stability Board, or FSB, with reviewing how climate-related risks were priced and accounted for in the capital markets. And this was done with the goal to better understand climate-related risks to the stability of the global financial system. And what the FSB found was that companies were underreporting climate-related risks, and that the capital markets lacked the information necessary to understand and indeed manage climate-related uncertainty. So to address this, the FSB created the TCFD in order to identify the information needed by investors, lenders, and insurance underwriters to appropriately assess and price climate-related risks and opportunities. And so in practical terms, this meant developing a set of global guidelines for reporting how climate change impacts corporate performance. And the task force included representatives from corporations, auditors, insurers, banks, and other key players in the capital markets. In 2017, the TCFD issued a set of disclosure recommendations, which are centered on the 4 pillars seen to your right. And these thematic areas represent the core of TCFD disclosure and should be understood holistically. The governance pillar asks companies to disclose the roles and responsibility of the board and senior management team with respect to managing climate-related risks. The strategy disclosure requires companies to report how their strategic and financial planning are impacted by climate-related risks and opportunities over various time horizons. In terms of risk management, the TCFD asks companies to report on processes for quantifying and managing these risks within the context of their overall risk management systems. And finally, companies can address the metrics and targets pillar by disclosing how they track their impact on climate change, as well as the practices for setting and achieving climate targets. And here we have some of the key themes and ideas behind these recommendations. The purpose of these animating principles really is to provide company stakeholders with clear, comparable, and decision-useful information on actual and possible impacts of climate change on the company. First, the recommendations were initially voluntary and remain so in most jurisdictions, but as Pratomo mentioned, regulators worldwide have shown interest in making TCFD disclosure mandatory. Climate-related risks and, disclosure should be as robust, comprehensive, and accessible as financial reporting, and should be included in mainstream reports. Also, the recommendations were initially targeted to a few specific sectors that are seen to have an outsized impact, although increasingly companies from all sectors are expected to report. Also, disclosing companies are expected to report on both physical risks and transition risks. And briefly, physical risks relate to risks caused directly by changes in weather and climate as a result of climate change, while transition risk refers to risks associated with the shift to a low carbon economy. And we'll go over this in greater detail in a moment. Further, the report should be forward-looking and communicate the company's vision for addressing risks and seizing opportunities, ideally through the use of scenario analysis, which we'll also return to in a moment. Also, because climate change poses risks that may not align with business cycles and credit cycles, data reported should be relevant across time horizons. And finally, each of the recommended disclosures calls for a different balance of quantitative and qualitative information. So here we have the sectors that were initially targeted by the TCFD. So for the financial group, the aim for these companies is to report on their financed emissions. So for example, banks will reveal emissions associated with their lending, and insurers will look at underwritten emissions. And the purpose in targeting financial institutions in particular is both to strengthen the financial system by more accurately pricing climate risks, and further, as a result, to better allocate capital to firms that are carrying out low carbon operations and strategies. Sectors in the non-financial sector are those that are seen as or acknowledged to be especially carbon and energy intensive. And these sectors are especially significant in Indonesia, where they account for well over half of the overall emissions profile. And like financial institutions, companies in these sectors benefit by identifying and avoiding risks, and also positioning themselves to better seize opportunities. And this naturally leads to greater access to capital, and with it, opportunities for growth. And so this list is not exhaustive, and companies with similar environmental profiles are also encouraged to disclose. And also, since disclosure expectations from investors and other stakeholders are increasingly tied to market cap rather than sector, companies from all sectors need to begin reporting. So now let's take a look at the recommendations themselves. Here we have each of the 4 pillars and the 11 recommended disclosures under these pillars. So starting from the left, in the governance pillar, the TCFD asks companies to disclose the governance structures and mechanisms used to address climate issues, specifically asking about board oversight of climate issues and the management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risks. And companies can start by disclosing current climate governance structures, if any, and work to incorporate strengthened governance mechanisms over time. And many companies also begin by publishing a policy or a commitment statement related to addressing climate change. As for the strategy pillar, here companies are asked to disclose the actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities within the context of the organization's business, strategy, and financial planning. And so the questions that are raised by this disclosure are, what are the risks that you have identified, again, over varying timeframes? And then having identified these risks, what are the estimated impacts should these risks come to pass? And then given the impact assessments, what is your strategy to manage these risks? And here, early stage companies can establish emissions reduction initiatives from their operational greenhouse gas emissions, and also join domestic and global initiatives to mitigate climate change as they develop strategies to address these issues. The risk management pillar asks companies to disclose how the organization identifies, assesses, and manages climate-related risks. And here you're asked to report how is it that you assess and identify risks? What are the processes involved, and how do they relate both to physical and transition risks? What are the systems and processes that are used to monitor and manage these risks? And how do these issues of climate risk fit into your overall risk management system? Are they integrated into a company-wide system, or are they looked at in some other way? And here companies can begin by acknowledging the need to assess and respond to climate-related risks, even if they lack the capacity to do so. And finally, with respect to metrics and targets, the TCFD asks companies to disclose those metrics and targets that they use to assess and manage climate-related risks and opportunities. So what are the measurements or the tools that you use to measure climate risk and opportunity? What are your emissions, both your your direct emissions, which we call scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and the indirect scope 3 emissions? What risks does this footprint expose you to? And then, having measured your emissions, what targets have you established, and how do you measure progress against these targets? And in this case, companies can begin by assessing their direct emissions and use this as a baseline to commit to and track further progress. Okay, so let's now consider how TCFD links the climate data that we talked about in the previous slide to data on financial impact on the company. So above the dotted line, we have climate data, and below we have financial impacts related to that climate data. So starting from the left, the TCFD divides risks into the two classes I mentioned in a previous slide: transition risks and physical risks. So for transition risks, this can mean, for example, policy and legal risks, like the increased pricing of GHG emissions, as Pratomo mentioned, as well as risks related to technology, including the costs associated to switching to lower emissions equipment, for example. There are also market and reputational risks, which are associated with changing consumer and stakeholder attitudes. As for physical risks, these are divided into acute risks, which are event-driven episodes like severe weather, and chronic risks. And these refer to long-term shifts in the climate, precipitation, temperature, and changing weather patterns, for example. So given all of those risks, there are also opportunities that can appear, particularly in the shape of opportunities for greater energy efficiency and access to new energy sources. And these opportunities can appear as interest in low emissions products and services, and access to new markets. And this is particularly important in countries and jurisdictions that set net zero targets. And opportunities also appear in terms of greater resilience, for example, through diversification. So whatever the company's particular circumstances and contexts, these risks and opportunities will have a direct impact on the company's financial performance and the elements below the dotted line. So for example, in terms of corporate income statements, changes in customer demand could, for example, lead to increased revenue for those companies that are able to offer low emissions goods and services. And on the other hand, legal and policy developments could raise expenditure in the form of higher compliance and litigation costs. With respect to balance sheets, physical risks, whether acute or chronic, could cause the early retirement or write-off of assets, either through damage to the assets or because the assets are now understood to be in a high-risk location. And on the other hand, companies switching to new energy sources, for example, could enjoy expanded access to capital as investors increasingly favor low-carbon energy generation. So in sum, climate change really will present each company with a unique set of risks and opportunities, and the TCFD format enables all companies to consider how these risks and opportunities will affect its current and future financial positions. So having looked at the components of the TCFD, we'll now move on to some of the key ideas behind a disclosure. And one of the most important concepts in TCFD reporting is materiality. And this is important because materiality determines which information should be included in your disclosure. And this is in part determined by the primary audience of the report. So to give a definition of materiality, the International Accounting Standards Board provides that information should be considered material if omitting, misstating, or obscuring it could reasonably be expected to influence the decisions of the primary users of the report. In other words, information is considered material if excluding or compromising that information would cause users to make decisions that they might otherwise not have made had they been provided with this information. And information is considered financially material if it is necessary for understanding the company's development, performance, and position. And climate data is therefore considered financially material when environmental conditions impact company performance. In contrast, environmental and social materiality extends this idea to include the impact of the company on the environment. And so the concept of double materiality encompasses both the impact of the company on the environment and vice versa. The primary audience for a TCFD report is actors in the capital markets. So the TCFD focuses primarily on financial materiality. Nonetheless, we encourage companies to consider the impacts that their actions have on climate, as these impacts can be financially material if they have consequences on company performance. So another feature of TCFD disclosure is that reports should be forward-looking. And a key tool in preparing a forward-looking disclosure is the use of climate-related scenario analysis, which enables companies to develop plans in the context of uncertainty with respect to future climate conditions. And this allows companies to explore alternatives to business as usual assumptions. And so a scenario, to begin with, describes a pathway of development that leads to a particular outcome. So, for example, a 1.5 degree scenario would include assumptions about developments that would limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. Each scenario contains a set of assumptions made about the future and the actions taken by, for example, regulators and customers. Companies then analyze how their businesses would fare under these differing conditions. And the TCFD asks companies to consider different pathways toward a 2 degree or lower scenario. So of course, it's impossible to predict the future, but companies can ensure that their business and strategy is resilient to potential risks that will arise, no matter whether we find ourselves in a 1.5 degree scenario, a trajectory rather, or a 3.4 degree trajectory. What is important is not so much the credibility of analysis results, but the company's transparency and commitment to preparing various scenarios. Okay, so now let's look briefly at climate scenarios a little bit more closely. So in short, climate scenarios lay out possible future states that differ by level of warming. And the graph to the left illustrates how different emissions levels lead to different temperature outcomes. And to the right are some of the risks associated with 1.5 degree warming and 2 degree warming. And as you can see, risks across all indicators multiply as temperatures increase. And these projections enable companies to think through future climate conditions and the impact of these conditions on corporate performance. And so while, of course, it is important to understand scenarios and associated risks in detail and to consider what they may mean for your business, the point for now is that no matter which scenarios are used in your analysis, there will always be some risk associated with climate change. And increasingly, the capital markets expect companies to have plans to navigate these risks. And this is why companies are asked to examine different pathways and understand the risks and opportunities associated with each. And the TCFD recommends looking at least 2 scenarios to do this. So given the importance of scenario analysis, it might be helpful to take a slightly closer look at the role that assumptions play in scenarios. So as I mentioned, all scenarios include certain assumptions and analytical methods. And so companies are asked to detail these when reporting their use and results of scenario analysis. And so here we have a simple chart showing some of the risks and assumptions associated with 1.5 degree scenario and a 3.4 degree scenario. So the 1.5 degree scenario indicates an orderly transition expedited with instruments like a carbon tax and changes to the supply of energy and development of green technologies. On the other hand, the disorderly 3.4 degree scenario anticipates few changes in climate policy and energy supply, but correspondingly more extreme physical risks in the shape of Arctic melting, crop failure, and widespread flooding. And so clearly the strategies needed to adapt to a 1.5 degree scenario will be very different from the strategy needed to adapt to a 3.4 degree scenario. And companies can report varying degrees of resilience for each scenario. And finally, it's important to note some risks emerge immediately, whereas others appear later. And so companies are asked to report the result of scenario analysis across different timeframes. So with those key concepts in mind, we'll briefly review the actual implementation of the TCA since the recommendations were issued. And we can do that by looking at the TCFD's 2020 status report. And this examined reports from over 1,000 companies worldwide between 2017 and 2019. The TCFD surveyed companies on efforts to implement the recommendations and expert users on the usefulness and relevance of the TCFD-aligned disclosures. And the key findings were that nearly 60% of the world's top 100 companies either support the TCFD report in line with the TCFD recommendations or both. And what this suggests is that releasing a TCFD-aligned report is seen as best practices among the largest companies. And among all sectors, energy and materials and building sectors lead on disclosure. Although disclosure of climate-related financial information has increased since 2017, further progress is clearly still needed. So in particular, disclosure of the potential financial impact of climate change remains low, with only 1 in 15 companies reporting on the resilience of their strategy. And again, this suggests that some of the blind spots that the TCFD was meant to address still remain today. Despite these gaps, expert users found the impact reporting on the impact of climate change on the company's business and strategy to be the most useful decision in for decision making. And so companies may wish to prioritize these areas when they're preparing their reports. Okay, so I'll just wrap up by quickly reviewing some of the policy developments in the area. So as I mentioned, and as Pratimo alluded to a moment or two ago, TCFD recommendations were initially meant to be voluntary, but we do see that governments are increasingly interested in mandatory disclosure in order to ensure that the recommendations are taken up at a pace and at a scale necessary to address those blind spots in the markets. So as Pratimo mentioned, we have countries as diverse in the region as Hong Kong, New Zealand, and Malaysia making good progress on this. In the UK, we have indications that companies will be expected to report against the TCFD by 2025. And in the US, both the Senate and the Securities and Exchange Commission are considering actions to strengthen disclosure requirements. In Canada, the government has recommended a comply or explain approach. And Ottawa is also tying COVID relief funds to reporting climate data. In the EU, TCFD is already part of the non-binding guidance for the non-financial reporting directive and is likely to be incorporated into the directive itself soon. We've seen similar regulatory advances in Australia in terms of identifying climate change as a systemic risk and developing climate reporting guidance. And also Japan has held a TCFD summit for the past years, and regulators are increasingly encouraging companies to integrate the TCFD into their annual reporting processes. So with that, I hope this review gives you a clear understanding of the TCFD and gets across what we're seeing, which is that beginning the TCFD reporting process now really will be critical, both in terms of staying ahead of these regulatory developments and in terms of meeting growing investor expectations. So thank you for your attention. I'll hand it now back to my colleague Rini.
Thank you, Joe. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Bapak Ibu sekalian, terima kasih atas presentasinya rekan saya Joe. Sekarang kita akan memasuki sesi istirahat. Tadi kalau sebelumnya saya bilang ada sesi Q&A, tapi karena waktu kita agak ketat kali ini, kami akan menggabungkan sesi tanya jawab ke dalam sesi tanya jawab di akhir acara ini. Oleh sebab itu, saat ini kita akan ada sesi 5 menit break, mini break, dan mohon Bapak dan Ibu sekalian untuk kembali lagi ke dalam ruangan webinar dalam waktu 5 menit. Presentasi yang pertama nanti akan dilanjutkan oleh rekan saya Fred yang akan membahas mengenai developing a TCFD roadmap through CDP. Baiklah, silahkan ambil minum, silahkan untuk break. Kita akan kembali dalam waktu 5 menit lagi. Terima kasih. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, waktu untuk mini break kita sudah berakhir. Selanjutnya, mari kita masuki, seperti yang tadi sudah saya sebutkan, sesi untuk developing a TCFD roadmap through CDP yang akan dibawakan oleh rekan saya, Frederick Anderson. Over to you, Fred.
Thank you very much, Rini, and thanks everyone again for joining us today. And as you know, before the break, my colleague Joe explained what the TCFD recommendations are. And then in the following section, I will present more on how companies can use CDP's framework to build a roadmap towards TCFD alignment. And so to do that, first, I will introduce CDP and what we do. So CDP was founded in 2003 and is now the largest platform for self-reported corporate environmental data in the world. So in short, CDP provides an online platform and questionnaire where companies can report on their environmental performance. And since we started about 20 years ago, we now have the most comprehensive collection of self-reported environmental data, and CDP is considered the gold standard for environmental reporting. And this slide shows how we work with companies. So CDP reach out to companies on behalf of our investor signatories who would like to better understand the environmental performance of organizations in which they are shareholders or that they are considering investing in. Screening a company for environmental metrics is now a fundamental action required by most large investors, such as institutional investors. In addition to our investor signatories, we also reach out to suppliers on behalf of large purchasing organizations that reach out to CDP because they are interested in better understanding the environmental risks, impacts, and performance within their supply chains. So on behalf of these stakeholders, we reach out to companies to collect the environmental data through our online questionnaire. The benefit of this is that our investors' signatories can access the data from a centralized location and, importantly, in a standardized and comparable manner. There are also many benefits for the companies who report through our platform, and many do it even if they are not requested by investors or their customers. And we will get more into these benefits in a few slides. And just to give you an idea of our scope of work, so despite the challenges of the COVID pandemic, 9,600 companies worldwide reported data through CDP's platform in 2020. Of these, about 3,000 companies were based in Asia Pacific, and the largest concentration was in the Greater China region, so really showing how much disclosure we are seeing in Asia. In Indonesia, 33 companies reported environmental data through CDP in 2020, up from 27 the year prior, showing a positive trend. And this slide just shows the growth that we have seen in corporate environmental reporting since we started. And as you can see, the momentum has been growing. As I mentioned earlier, in addition to our investor signatories who benefit from receiving the data, there are also many benefits to the companies who report through our platform. For example, by reporting through the standardized framework, you will be able to much more accurately benchmark and learn from local and global peers to understand which areas you are performing well and which areas you can improve in. So this is possible not just because of the standardization, but also because of our scoring methodology, which is illustrated on the slide. All companies who submit a response to CDP by the scoring deadline will receive a letter score from D to A, where A is the highest score. And the score is not intended to say if a company is bad or good. Rather, it is designed to highlight where on the journey to environmental leadership the company is. We fully recognize that environmental action is not something that is done overnight. It takes time, and this is what our scoring methodology is designed help it with. So at the most basic level is what we call the disclosure level, which you can see at the bottom of the pyramid. Here we look, we assess the companies to see if they are able to report, collect, and disclose environmental data. So it basically just looks at your ability to collect and disclose environmental information. The next level is the awareness band. Here we look at companies who are not only able to collect data, but who also have mechanisms in place to assess their exposure to climate-related issues. Next is the management level. And the management level, here we look at companies who have taken the findings from their assessment and have actions, this can be initiatives in place to manage and mitigate climate-related risks. And then finally, on the leadership level, on the top of the pyramid, here we see companies who are really raising the bar in environmental action and who are setting best practice initiatives such as science-based emissions reduction targets, which are targets that align with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And on the left-hand side, you can see the score that correspond with each of these levels. So by receiving a score, you can use it as an indicator to understand where your company is located in the journey towards environmental leadership and compare with other companies. Here you can see an example of the score feedback that you will receive, and you don't get just an overall score, you also get a breakdown and 11 different category scores. And so these spider graphs can help you to break down your score and get easy insights into where you perform well and where you can improve. And also for transparency, credibility, and to help the companies who are responding to CDP, our scoring methodology is publicly available in full on our website, so you can go and use that if you want. And then this way, anyone can see how every question in our questionnaire is assessed and scored. So to avoid any conflicts of interest when it comes to our scoring, we also do not score the responses ourselves. We develop the scoring methodology, and then we will hire third-party scoring partners to do the scoring for us. And so how credible is CDP scoring? Last year, CDP was again rated #1 for the highest quality rating in the updated Rate the Raters report produced by Sustainability, where they asked sustainability experts to rate different ESG ratings on the screen by quality. Next slide, please. And then finally, as I said in the beginning, the data reported through CDP's platform is provided back to our investor signatories who use it for investment decision-making. However, public responses to CDP goes into many other hands as well across financial markets and civil society. So many of the major ESG research and rating providers, such as Bloomberg Terminals, DJSI, FTSE Russell, and others license data from CDP. So by submitting a response through the platform, you can engage and communicate your environmental efforts to a much wider ecosystem. So that are some of the reasons why third-party platforms for reporting environmental data, such as CDP, can benefit your organization. But let's get back to the initial point. How can you use our platform and questionnaire to develop a roadmap towards TCFD alignment? And so to recap what my colleague Joe said earlier, this slide shows the 11 recommended disclosures that the TCFD came up with under each of the 4 pillars. There are 2 recommendations under the governance pillar on the left. And for strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, there are 3 recommendations each. And companies who are able to report accurately and comprehensively against these 11 recommendations will align with the current global best practice and meet the expectations of the global investor community when it comes to environmental disclosure. The issue is that these recommendations are still somewhat up for interpretation, And many companies struggle to determine exactly what to report under each of these recommendations. And this is where CDP comes in and can help. So CDP takes the 11 recommendations and turn them into specific questions with clear guidance and assessment criteria. In other words, the TCFD recommendations provide guidelines for what investors want to know, and then CDP's questionnaire break down those guidelines into actionable metrics. This means that CDP provides an ideal roadmap for companies looking to disclose on environmental issues in alignment with the TCFD. We also provide clear guidance and resources to support companies on the environmental journey. And yeah, finally, as we talked about earlier, the scoring methodology can also help you identify room for improvement. So the outcome of this conversion from TCFD guidelines to CDP questions is shown on the mapping slide here. Again, you can see the TCFD recommendations, and then in red color, you can now see which questions within the CDP questionnaire aligns to each of the recommendations. And as you can see, there are roughly 50 questions in our questionnaire that companies should answer to ensure full alignment with the 11 recommended TCFD disclosures. This highlights the need for comprehensive reporting to meet investor expectations. So in the following slides, I will go through the 4 TCFD pillars and give you examples of what these questions look like, as well as what best practice is considered. So without further ado, let's get started with governance. The governance pillar is intended to capture the governance structure of your company with regards to climate change, and it provides data users with an understanding of the organization's approach to climate-related issues at the board and management levels. The slide on the screen shows the typical steps we see companies go through to reach best practice in climate governance. So we often just see it being a topic on general meetings. And once climate issues is a topic at senior management and board meetings, that's where we see these translate into goals and objectives, such as emissions reduction targets and so forth. And board level oversight of climate related issues is considered best practice, and it provides a strong indication of the importance of climate change to your organization. Next, please. Here you can see the TCFD recommendations again under the governance pillar on the left-hand side, and you can see the corresponding questions in the CDP questionnaire that address these on the right-hand side. So we ask companies again whether there is board level oversight, what the highest management level responsibility for managing these issues are, and then we also drill down further to understand what are the specific roles of the board and senior management positions when it comes to climate oversight and management. In addition, I've also included some of the response details that companies should include to make this a comprehensive response. So if you look at the TCFD recommended disclosures at face value, some of them may seem very basic or even yes/no questions. However, it's important to provide comprehensive answers to give a clear and transparent response. So in our questions, there is not only free text, but also drop-down options that the company should complete. For example, we ask about the frequency of discussing climate-related issues at meetings, the details of the governance mechanisms, whether there are incentives tied to climate targets or goal, and so forth. So by answering all these questions and drop-down options, you can provide a clear picture of your organization's approach to climate governance. Not only if there is board level oversight, but what are the mechanisms in place to ensure that the issues that are discussed at the board level are taken down the chain to management and effectively implemented, monitored, and reported on throughout the organization. For example, we can look at City Developments Limited, or CDL's reported governance structure for climate issues in their CDP response. So CDL is a Singapore-listed international real estate operating company with a global presence in 29 countries and regions. So you can see the climate governance structure illustrated on this screen. So first, on the board level, on the top of the screen, CDL has a board sustainability committee. It comprises 3 independent directors and the group CEO. And this committee meets at least twice a year to review the company's ESG performance, looking at potential climate-related risks and so forth, and to set the strategic direction to implement various action and initiatives, such as low carbon initiatives. And the board level committee receives a quarterly report and frequent updates on significant ESG trends and activities by the Chief Sustainability Officer, or CSO, at the management level. And then at the management level, at the bottom of the screen, CDL has a sustainability committee as well that is responsible for supporting the company's ESG strategies that were determined by the board, and also to measure key performance indicators. This committee is chaired by the CSO and reports to the board. This management committee is company-wide and multidisciplinary, comprising representatives from both the management and working levels, cutting across all corporate and operational units that are material to the business. And so this committee is responsible for implementing and monitoring and reporting on the various aspects of CDL's sustainability practices and performance. So having this comprehensive approach at the management level ensures that CDL is addressing all aspects of their business and takes a realistic and holistic approach to governance and action on climate-related issues. It also ensures that they help implement the vision of the board throughout the organization. Next slide, please. The second TCFD pillar is the strategy pillar. And once the company has a vision and governance structure around climate issues, the next natural step is to integrate it into business strategy. Again, here we see a typical trajectory that companies often follow. Again, it's once you have a governance structure, it should naturally start to implement your business strategy. And once you are looking at issues that your organization is exposed to, you should also start considering forward-looking climate-related issues. We know that climate change is getting more and more severe, and so having forward-looking metrics is really important to position yourself well for potential upcoming issues. And one of the tools that we see more and more used, as Joe mentioned, is climate-related scenario analysis. And we will talk more about this in our next workshop, where you can learn how companies are using these tools to support their climate governance and strategy. And next slide, please. And to understand how a company is implementing climate issues into their strategy, the TCFD has 3 recommended disclosures asking how climate risks have impacted the organization over various time horizons, as well as how they have impacted the company's operational and financial planning. Again, here CDP breaks the TCFD guidelines into multiple questions, some of them shown on the right-hand side. We ask companies to provide details of any climate-related risks and opportunities that they have identified with as much granularity and detail as possible. For example, we ask for the type of impact of the climate risk, for example, whether it is a transitional risk, for example, from a changing regulatory environment, or is it a physical risk from more extreme weather events. We are also asking questions about the potential financial impacts of these risks and opportunities. What are the relevant time horizons and the likely impact, and so forth. To understand how companies are addressing these risks, we also ask for detailed information about what the company is doing to adjust its operational and financial planning accordingly. And as with the first pillar, the TCFD recommended disclosure under strategy may seem like somewhat basic questions at face value. But by following the CDP questionnaire, you can build a more comprehensive and detailed response that is useful for data users to understand and get a clear picture of how your organization is approaching and addressing these issues at the strategic level. Next, we move on to the third pillar, which is risk management. This is closely related to what we discussed under strategy. Evaluating exposure to climate-related risks and opportunities is really important for developing a strategy for the global transition to a low-carbon economy that is recognized in the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. So to improve your climate risk assessment, most companies have already an enterprise risk management system, or ERM, in place to assess and manage various types of climate-related risks. When companies first started assessing climate risks, we saw them doing so usually by developing a standalone risk assessment process for this. As the years went by and climate risk has become part of standard risk assessments, we now usually see climate risks assessment being fully integrated into company-wide risk assessment processes. This is also what CDP considers best practice. Again, you can see the TCFD recommended disclosures for risk management on the left-hand side and some of the corresponding questions from the CDP questionnaire on the right-hand side. Here, we are asking for a further breakdown of the risks that we talked about under strategy, under the strategy pillar. The aim is to better understand the processes the company has in place to identify, assess, and importantly, respond to climate issues. Again, things that help us understand this is looking at the processes themselves, but also other things such as the frequency of your assessment, the scope. Are you only looking at direct operations, or are you looking at your up and downstream? The types of risks that you are assessing, the time horizons considered, and so forth. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, we also ask the company if it's able to estimate a potential financial impact of the risk by providing a fixed amount or an estimated range. So all in all, this information can help the company and also investors to assess the potential impacts to valuations and the adequacy of the company's risk response. And then finally, we come to the fourth and final pillar, metrics and targets. Target setting provides direction and structure to environmental strategy, and providing information on quantitative targets and qualitative goals and the progress made against these targets, it can demonstrate your organization's commitment to improving climate-related issues at a corporate level. And this information is relevant to investors because it helps them understand how your company is addressing, monitoring progress regarding the risks and opportunities disclosed in the previous sections that we discussed. And here we are also just finally looking at the TCFD recommendations for metrics and targets on the left and some of the CDP questions on the right. So here we first look at the emissions profiles reported by companies, whether the company is able to report on their scope 1 and 2 emissions, as Joe said, which are direct and indirect emissions. If relevant, we also encourage companies to report on their scope 3 emissions, which are indirect emissions from your value chain. Then the next step we look at is whether the data is verified by third-party auditors. Verification ensures reliable, credible, and quality-assured information. We then ask for absolute emissions reduction targets, intensity targets to reduce your emissions, net zero carbon targets, and other types of reduction initiatives to reduce your emissions. For example, questions on low carbon products provide valuable information to investors who are seeking to increase their investment in companies who are providing low carbon and climate resilient goods and services. And again, as I mentioned, What we consider best practice are science-based emissions reduction targets, or SBTs. And these are targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And in some of our subsequent workshops later in the year, we will go more into detail about this. And there's a lot of resources available to help companies set and validate science-based emissions reduction targets. And nearly 1,000 companies worldwide now has done so through an initiative called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So we will share more information about that later. So since CDP collects data on an annual basis, we can track the progress of these types of targets by looking at the company's overall emissions profile year on year to assess the change. So that's an introduction to how you can use CDP's questionnaire and framework. And next slide, please. As a tool to start collecting and reporting data in alignment with the TCFD recommendations. And since the CDP questionnaire is fully aligned with all of the recommended disclosures, your CDP response will assist your consistency with the TCFD recommendation. So again, you can use the framework to identify which type of information you should report under each of the 11 recommended disclosures from the TCFD. So that's it from me. As I mentioned, in future workshops, and the one that we have later in June, we will go more in detail and focus on climate risk assessments and climate-related scenario analysis. So we look forward to having you join us for that. But in the following part, I will hand it over to my colleague, Elim, who will share more information about the practical steps that you can take and which other supporting resources you can use to get started on your own roadmap for TCFD aligned reporting. So Ellen, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Fred. Is my audio okay? Just want to confirm.
Yes, I can hear you well, Ellen.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Ellen, and this is my pleasure to be here today. In this session, I would like to show you where to find online resources that are developed to help more companies make better quality environmental reporting and align with TCFD recommendations. Next, please. To start with, next slide, please.
Ellen, I can see the TCFD checklist. Is that the right side?
Okay. I can see it now.
Okay, great.
In this session, I would like to show you where to find to start with, this checklist here shows 10 practical steps that you can take to start disclosing to CDP and integrating TCFD recommendations into standard business processes. So we have 10 points here. On the left, the first 2 points are about mainstreaming climate-related risk and opportunity through your internal cooperation and integration. The third point is related to making the most of your company's risk management system and process. Next, using existing quality assurance and company approaches, compliance approaches for identifying and evaluating climate risk and financial impacts. Moving on to number 5, using existing tools such as CDP's questionnaire to collect data. 6, suggestions on linking climate and financial information. 7, engaging investors for feedback. 8, reporting as if your report is going to be assured. And the next point relates to using at least 2 climate scenarios. And finally, using your mainstream report as a vehicle for disclosure. To help you prepare for TCFD aligned disclosure, you may look through the checklist from the slide and think about how your organization could apply these steps internally. Through this process, you would be able to identify the barriers your organization may face. Then you can prioritize actions and allocate resources to overcome these barriers along your CDP reporting journey. So the checklist I mentioned just now is an excellent tool to help you quickly review your readiness. Whereas TCFD official website holds many detailed guidance explaining specific areas of TCFD disclosures. For example, they have guidance aimed at companies who are interested in integrating climate-related risk into their existing risk management processes, and technical supplement advises companies on conducting climate-related scenario analysis. TCFD also publishes status reports, which describe the progress companies are making in implementing the TCFD recommendations. Apart from these guidance, the TCFD Knowledge Hub is an e-learning platform developed together by CDSB, Climate Disclosure Standards Board, and the TCFD. The Knowledge Hub provides the latest tools, resources, case studies, and insights to help organizations learn about disclosing climate-related information. And you can see it as a database containing all kinds of TCFD-related materials that is accessible by the public. And from this Knowledge Hub, you can also enroll for free courses that are designed to fill the organization's knowledge gap and enhance their disclosures of climate-related information. Content of these courses were developed with insight from industry experts and suitable for a range of audiences, from those who are new to climate reporting to those who want to build on their existing skill sets. Next is about our building blocks report. While the information provided in the CDP response cover much of the same ground as the TCFD recommendations. And the next slide should be about the building blocks report, in case there's some delays on my side. It is best practice for these reported material, climate-related financial disclosures, to be included in the financial annual report to meet the expectations of the TCFD. So CDSB and CDP came together and created a new guide called Building Blocks. This report includes step-by-step guidance explaining how you can take your information in your CDP response and reports in your mainstream report. And we do this by highlighting the most relevant CDP climate change questions and explains how this information can be best used for reporting in the mainstream report using CDSB's reporting principles and requirements. And for more examples of TCFD aligned, you may download the TCFD Good Practice Handbook from the link embedded on this slide, which we will send it to you all after this webinar. And these materials are now available in English online, and we will be translating some of this guidance from English to Bahasa Indonesia in the coming months. And we will be sharing them with you once they are ready. So please stay tuned to that. Next slide, last but not least, as my colleague Fred explained, here we have all the material from our CDP website and more. So the CDP's questionnaire is designed to be fully aligned with TCFD, and you may find the full questionnaire from links on this page. Besides, the question-by-question guidance document and scoring methodology are also publicly available on our CDP website. If you wish to familiarize yourself with CDP disclosures, I would encourage you to look at our reporting guidance after the session. And in the guidance, we also indicate which questions are connected to other frameworks such as TCFD, SDG, and DJSI. Of course, you're also always welcome to reach out to us if you would like to know more about how to start disclosing through CDP. And with that, I will hand it back to Fred. Thank you.
Thank you, Elim, for the presentation. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Untuk presentasi selanjutnya, saya akan sedikit memberikan perkenalan mengenai pembicara kita hari ini, yaitu Mr. Lee Kokvi dari Wilmar International Limited. Mr. Lee saat ini bekerja sebagai manajer keberlanjutan di Wilmar International Limited. Dalam posisi ini, tugas utama beliau adalah untuk mengelola analisis dan pelaporan data terkait keberlanjutan. Perjalanan beliau dalam bidang keberlanjutan dimulai sejak tahun 2009, di mana beliau pertama kali bergabung dengan Departemen Teknis di Wilmar untuk mengembangkan proyek penangkapan gas metan di pabrik sawit. Pengalaman beliau mencakup berbagai proyek keberlanjutan seperti pengembangan kredit karbon, keuangan berkelanjutan maupun pelaporan berkelanjutan. Langsung saja saya persilahkan Mr. Lee untuk memberikan paparannya hari ini. Mr. Lee, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Bu Rini. Can everyone hear me clearly? Okay, so can I have the next slide, please? Hi, morning everyone. So thank you, Bu Rini, again for the kind introduction, and a very good morning to everyone on the call. Before I start with my presentation, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers for developing this very interesting and useful workshop, and to thank the attendees as well for taking the time out to join in. It is my pleasure to actually be given this opportunity to share with peer companies some insights into Wilmar's journey in climate change management and reporting. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So for the benefit of those who are not very familiar with the name Wilmar, I will just give a very brief introduction of who we are and what we actually do. So founded in 1991, Wilmar International Limited is today Asia's leading agribusiness group. We are a global leader in processing and merchandising all sorts of commodities, ranging from edible oils, oilseed crushing, sugar, oleochemicals, specialty fats, palm biodiesel, flour, rice, and even consumer packed oils. Specifically for Indonesia, we are actually one of the largest oil palm plantation owners, as well as the largest palm oil refiner and palm kernel crusher in Indonesia. We are also one of the biggest specialty fats, oleochemicals, and biodiesel manufacturer for Indonesia. Last but not least, if you have heard of the name Sanya brand, we are actually the largest producer of branded consumer packs in Indonesia too. So moving on, next slide, please. Okay, so following the sharing by Ms. Pratima earlier on, I would think it would be quite clear by now that there is an increasing trend and demand by various stakeholders, be it investors, bankers, civil societies, or regulators, asking for disclosures on key environmental, social, and governance topics, or in short, ESG. So different stakeholders have different priorities on what disclosures they want, but common across all is the greater and better disclosure on these wider sustainability factors, not just financial performance. So zooming into the environmental spectrum, climate change is without doubt a topic that will likely be considered a key material topic for almost all companies to report on. As BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, mentioned in their 2020 letter to CEOs, climate change has become a defining factor in companies' long-term prospect. We in Wilmar do not see this as a passing trend as well, and believe that the need to manage climate change impacts would be here to stay. In fact, our journey to mitigate climate change risks while identifying the opportunities to capitalize on have started more than 15 years ago. So back then, if you still recall, there was the Kyoto Protocol and CDM. So our timeline journey, as you can see in this slide here, started way back in 2006, when we first implemented our CDM projects and delved into the early days of carbon credits. And this progress and this journey of ours has spanned 15 years and more. And up to the latest year of 2021, which is this year, we have finally aligned our reporting in our sustainability report with TCFD as well. So in 2006, as you can see in the timeline, we actually registered our first CDM project, a renewable energy generation project using biomass as its fuel source at a refinery in Malaysia. Following the successful implementation, we subsequently roll out more CDM and VCS projects across operations in Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and China. This, I would say, would be the first step of our whole climate change mitigation and opportunities. So in 2007, we further engaged a consultant to conduct a wide-scale study to calculate our group's total carbon footprint, as well as the carbon gas emissions intensity for specific production outputs. This study and the result of it helped us identify the key contributors to our group's emission footprint, and thus guide us in the subsequent years how to formulate our future steps to manage these factors. Next slide, please. So moving on, so after 2007, sorry, I think you have to move back one slide. One more slide behind. Yes, correct. Okay, sorry. So after 2007, one of the key results from this study that we took with a consultant was that palm oil mill emissions was actually largely driven by emissions from our palm oil mill effluent, which is the wastewater coming out from our mills. So during the anaerobic treatment of this effluent, the methane is actually emitted up to the atmosphere, which accounts for up to 90% on average for the total mill emissions. So the reason why this is not as high as like the fuel consumption is because in general, most of the palm oil mills in Malaysia and Indonesia are actually using electricity generated from renewable sources, like the byproducts from our milling process, such as empty fruit branches, kernel shells, and mill fiber. These are actually renewable fuel sources which have very low emission factors and thus minimal impact to the overall mill footprint. And that's the reason why 90% of our overall total mill emissions actually do come from the effluent treatment instead of the fuel usage. So with this understanding in mind, our focus was actually to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions for this 90%. And thus, we constructed our very first methane capture or methane recovery project at one of our mills in North Sumatra. Since then, we have actually invested heavily in expanding our portfolio of methane capture projects since 2008. And we actually set out a target to build 25 methane capture plants, or more than half of all of our mills across the world at key mills. So this actually we actually have successfully achieved this target in 2020 last year. And with the full operations of these sites, we were actually able to avoid close to 600,000 tons of CO2 emissions in 2020. Similar to our palm oil mills, our sugar mills in Australia and India also use a lot of biomass to generate renewable electricity. These are usually generated from cane bagasse, which is a form of byproduct of crushing sugar cane. And this is the main fuel source used to power our mills. Because of this fuel source and the extra electricity that we can generate out, surplus of this electricity are actually sold to our national grids to support the overall country or regional efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, Wilmar is actually the largest generator of renewable biomass energy in Australia. Moving on to the next slide, please. Right. So similarly to the mill kind of efforts that we have undertaken to improve our footprint and to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, for the plantations, the biggest and most significant emission footprint or the contribution to the emission footprint is actually from land use change and pit soils. Land use change, especially in the form of deforestation, are the second largest anthropogenic source of atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions. The reason is because trees can help prevent climate change by capturing and storing huge amount of carbon dioxide from the air, and cutting them down would release this carbon back to the atmosphere while losing future ability to absorb existing carbon dioxide. Similarly, peatland degradation would also emit greenhouse gas emissions significantly. So with this understanding as well, we tried to focus on this as the major, most material kind of footprint contribution and try to do something about it. How we go about doing it is, in 2013, Wilmar actually launched a first ever NDP policy, no deforestation, no peat, and no exploitation policy that aims to advance an environmentally and socially responsible palm oil industry. The key to this policy was that the scope extends beyond just our own operations, but also to joint ventures and third-party suppliers, which is the first for the industry. With our strong commitment to this policy and active engagements with various suppliers on compliance, this will help reduce significant carbon emissions that would have otherwise contributed heavily to our Scope 1 emissions, which is our own operations, and Scope 3 emissions, which is our supply chain. Actually, it is very heartening to know that this momentum has actually carried over to the wider palm industry. And from the recent New York Declaration on Forest 5-year assessment report, deforestation in Indonesia between 2017 and 2018 has actually reduced by more than 30% compared to the average annual loss rates from 2002 to 2016. Similarly, in a 2019 Chain Reaction Research report, it was estimated that NDP pledges have spared more than 6.4 million hectares of forest from oil palm development. So these are all the actually various initiatives in place that we have pushed for plantations that has resulted in quite a significant impact in the overall carbon emission and mitigation kind of the results. Moving on to the next slide, please. So on top of preventing further deforestation and peat development from happening, which is mainly driven from our NDP policy, we are also working on maintaining and building up the carbon storage capacity of the world, which is to conserve and restore forests. As of end December 2020, more than 30,000 hectares, or almost 10% of our total land bank, are conservation areas. Work on riparian restoration is also an important part of our conservation efforts, which have resulted in more than 300 hectares of land in Indonesia restored over 8 sites over the last few years. But however, I think one of the key initiatives I would like to highlight here today is actually this major initiative that Wilmar is working in collaboration with other buyers and processors. This is what we call the Rimba Collective, as you can see from the slide here. This is an initiative to collectively support long-term sustainable conservation and restoration of forests. It aims to provide $1 billion to protect or restore 500,000 hectares of forest, which can support up to 32,000 individuals in forest communities in Southeast Asia over 25 years. And this work starts in Indonesia. The project was recently launched in early April this year, and Wilmar is really excited to be part of this initiative to further push this agenda on forest conservation. Next slide, please. Right. So all those are all the various strategies and risk managements that we have set in place to reduce and mitigate all the climate change impacts. So now, how do we then report all these milestones? In 2015, although Wilmar actually has reported to CDP climate change module back in 2010, after we have completed the 2007 carbon footprint study, but we have only recently started, not recently I would say, actually we have started reporting consistently from 2015 onwards to the CDP climate change module for climate related disclosures. And this actually has improved further in 2018 because in 2018, with the TCFD recommendations published in June 2017, and CDP aligning its questions and disclosures with TCFD recommendations, ourselves, we were actually driven to answer the questions, and thus we actually conducted a qualitative scenario analysis to identify all the possible impacts that climate change can have on our business. Although this current scenario analysis is still quite catered to our upstream operations, because we believe that upstream operations are where the most material impacts would be on. But we do feel that this analysis was really helpful in structuring our mindset and moving us towards the right direction so that we can slowly roll out more of our scope for our study into the downstream operations as well. And as I mentioned earlier on, 2021, which is this year, we have just recently launched our latest Sustainability Report 2020 about last month in May. And that report has finally aligned our reporting to TCFD recommendations as well as on the 4 pillars as well. So moving on to the next slide, please. Okay, so those were all very key initiatives and milestones that we have achieved for both our upstream operations as well as the reporting. But we do have emission reductions efforts for factories as well, although we haven't been really reporting too much of it. But in our SR 2020, which was recently launched, you would be able to find a lot more information on those. So unsurprisingly, for the factories, the main source of emissions would come from the direct consumption of fossil fuel or fossil energies, as well as the indirect energy consumption from electricity and steam purchases. So in order to mitigate all these emissions from factories, we do have a number of initiatives in place across different entities around the world. So some examples that we are picking out here would be our subsidiary in China, Ihai Kerry Arawana. We actually also built multiple biogas plants across various operations to recycle our wastewater and sewage in order to generate renewable energy from the biogas collected. This is actually supported and driven by what we have learned from our earlier experience of building biogas plants from our upstream operations. So in 2020 as well, YKA has actually reached an agreement with a technology partner to construct photovoltaic power plants in all of our factories across China. It is expected by end of 2021, the group will have in place a distributed PV station of more than 110 megawatts peak with an annual electricity generation of more than 109 million kilowatt hours. This has also, we have also switched a lot of our fuel usage from coal to natural gas and built integrated factories to reduce resource and energy usage. These are all the various initiatives that you can also try to take some leaf out of the book from to see how it can apply in your own operations as well. Similarly, for our another subsidiary called Goodman Fielder, they have actually committed to using 100% renewable electricity by 2025 with solar projects like a 320 kilowatt peak solar installation in Fiji, as well as purchasing of renewable energy certificates in line with the RE100 technical guidelines. Through a combination of operational efficiencies and capital investments, like innovative use of heat recovery in boilerless bakeries, optimizing distribution of products across country, Goodman Fielder is actually targeting to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. So these are all the various initiatives that we have tried to push out and roll out across from upstream operations all the way to the downstream operations. But last but not least, the next slide, please. Sorry, can I have the next slide? Right, thanks. So the various initiatives that I've shared earlier on were mainly catered to handle the climate change mitigation approach. However, we also do need to look into the climate change adaptation because climate change impacts are already being felt in various parts of the world, affecting the food and agriculture sectors. Thus, by playing our part in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from all the initiatives that we shared earlier, it is also imperative that as a business, we should set a path towards climate change adaptation to build resilience for the future. Some of the ways we do that is by future-proofing our resilience of our crops, by investing in R&D, research and development of palm seedlings and sugarcane variants so that they can be more resilient to extreme weather patterns. These seedlings are also sold to smallholders and smaller companies to ensure reliability of future suppliers to our mills. Similarly, there is also a growing shift in consumer preferences on the demand side, with more customers opting for responsibility and sustainability produced commodities. These are the potential transition risks, whether it's reputational or market access, to be managed. So if a company wants to remain competitive in the future world, it is important and critical that they adjust to market needs and expectations and ensure that the sustainability practices are embedded within the business model. And also looking at the shifting consumer demand for food with less impact on the environment, there are opportunities within to be capitalized as well. One example how we do that is we actually use R&D to invest and identify products which are like plant-based protein to reduce beef reliance, as well as production of soaps or detergents using vegetable-based surfactants. So moving on to my last slide, I would just the next slide, please. Right. So moving on to the last slide here, I would just want to round off my presentation quickly by sharing some lessons or key lessons that we have learned through this journey thus far. So the first one would be material impacts. we do need to start by focusing on which are the most material and the ones that can have the biggest contribution to the company's footprint, and then access of all the solutions that we can undertake, which would result in the biggest impacts. Because, so one example is for us, when we started off our journey, we actually focus on the upstream operations, because as unpredictable and extreme weather patterns would directly impact the agricultural operations and would become a risk to food production, the focus for us initially was really on upstream, because that is where we believe there will be the biggest impact. Similarly, when we then did our study to manage and quantify all the footprint around our global operations, we noticed that we should just focus on the major ones, so the 80 or 90% kind of impacts, so that we can really have the major impact with the least efforts. This is similar to the 80-20 rule that we have focused on thus far. Last thing for this material impacts is more of, I would just want to share that there's actually no one-size-fits-all solution, but what is important is to identify what are the key contributions to each sector or business, and then focus on the mitigation efforts. The second point I would like to share is the collaboration. The drivers of deforestation are actually complex, and they involve different global forces, and which are beyond the power of just one industry or the company to tackle alone. So collective endeavor by businesses, governments, and communities, as well as civil society, would be required to effect real and lasting change on the ground. So the example that I showed earlier on, the Rimba Collective, is one such example. So the last point that I would like to share is on reporting frameworks. Reporting frameworks like TCFD and CDP are actually there to just get the conversation started with the necessary talking points. They encourage companies to start thinking about the various risks and opportunities that climate change presents. TCFD reporting, which personally I feel by itself should not be the end goal, but it should be something that companies can use to kickstart their thinking about climate change strategy, impacts, and targets, and how to go about managing all of it. For all you know, the management of all these topics could already have been implemented in different units or forms, and this would just help the company consolidate all these initiatives into a group level perspective for further analysis. So to end off my sharing, I would just like to reinforce the point that ESG is a critical topic for almost every organization across the globe, because this criteria gives the company insight into the overall risk exposure and long-term business sustainability. Not getting onto the ESG bandwagon can actually lead to negative consequences, not only for your company, but also the planet as well. Also, by leveraging on such risk and opportunity management and performance data, there are potential for generation of new business value, competitive advantage, as well as positive change for the company. With that, I will pass it on back to Bu Rini, and thank you once again for your time. Thank you.
Terima kasih, Mr. Lee, for your presentation. Untuk paparannya, Pak, terima kasih. Saya ingin mengucapkan kepada Bapak Lee Kofui untuk paparannya yang penuh dengan wawasan. Pemaparan Mr. Lee juga merupakan paparan terakhir dalam webinar ini. Selanjutnya kami akan sampaikan beberapa informasi penting terkait program training ini. Jadi Bapak dan Ibu tetap di tempat Anda. Kami akan menjawab beberapa pertanyaan yang sudah masuk ke dalam kotak Q&A. Tapi sebelumnya ada beberapa informasi terkait workshop kami di bulan mendatang. Seperti tadi sudah disebutkan, akan ada beberapa training yang akan membahas lebih dalam terkait implementasi TCFD. Untuk webinar selanjutnya akan diadakan tanggal 29 Juni yang akan mengupas lebih dalam mengenai penilaian risiko perubahan iklim dan skenario analisis terkait perubahan iklim. Di tanggal 30 Juni, webinar akan dibawakan oleh GRI yang akan membahas rencana aksi untuk SDGs. Lalu di bulan Oktober dan November akan ada juga webinar lanjutan terkait TCFD dan SDG, dan juga webinar terkait pasar modal dan keuangan berkelanjutan. Nah, Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, sedikit interaksi aktivitas yang interaktif. Untuk membantu kami dalam meningkatkan kualitas dari webinar kita yang akan datang, kami mohon partisipasi Bapak dan Ibu sekalian untuk mengisi survei sebagai umpan balik untuk sesi hari ini. Silahkan klik tautan atau scan QR code yang ada di layar. Kalau Bapak dan Ibu lihat di chat, itu juga sudah ada linknya. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian bisa mengklik link tersebut. partisipasi Bapak dan Ibu sekalian dalam mengisi survei ini akan sangat berguna bagi tim kami. Selanjutnya kami juga pada saat yang bersamaan untuk menyingkat waktu, kami akan mulai menjawab beberapa pertanyaan yang masuk ke dalam kotak Q&A. Saya akan meminta rekan saya Fred untuk memandu sesi tanya jawab ini. Over to you, Fred.
Thank you, Rini. Yeah, thanks again, everyone, and thanks again to Mr. Lee for the presentation. I think one point it's really good as you identify, Mr. Lee, and on companies, even though you're starting from new, you may already be doing many things related to climate governance, and so going through these exercises, it can really help you consolidate and identify things that you may not even consider as climate governance or action, but that are already taking place in your organization. We have some time for Q&A now. We've gotten in some questions. We will do our best to answer all of them. The ones that we do not have time to answer, we will follow up with you after the event, and we will also publish the Q&A log after the event. So, and again, please complete the survey on the screen by using the QR code or the link. It really helps us. So the first question we have, Joe, if I can address this to you, should we register our support to TCFD when we want to report climate risks and opportunities using their recommendations? And through which report can we deliver the information related to the TCFD?
Okay, thank you, Fred. And yeah, thank you for asking this question. It's a very good one. So first of all, with respect to becoming a TCFD supporter, that's a great idea. It's not required. If you would like to do that, you can check out the TCFD website, and we have a link to this in the follow-up material, and there's a form that you could fill out providing more information about your organization and indicating that you would like to support the TCFD. And so we certainly would encourage that, but it's not necessary. With respect to the second part of the question, how you can deliver or report the information. So the TCFD recommends that you include your climate-related data aligned with the TCFD guidelines in your mainstream financial reporting. So that would be in your annual report, for example, or through any other channels that you disseminate your that mainstream financial reporting. Thanks again for the question.
Thank you very much, Joe. We have a few more questions coming in. I'll do one more for you, Joe, while I have you here, also relating to the TCFD. So how, if the company is still not able to quantify risks and opportunities, how can the company still report in alignment with the TCFD recommendations?
Yeah, that's another great question. So, one of the good things about the TCFD guidelines is that, and this goes back to what Mr. Lee was saying a moment or two ago, that, companies at various stages of maturity will report things in different ways. So if you don't yet have the quantitative data on hand to give a really quantitative picture of the risks and opportunities and other factors, we would suggest that you, while you set up those systems to have in place, mechanisms to gather and report that data, begin by providing qualitative data instead. And again, a lot of the resources that my colleague Ellen talked about a moment or two ago will give an indication of how you can get started developing that more quantitative data.
Thank you, Joe. We have another question here. I'm happy to address this one. So the question is, which companies are being assessed by CDP? Does CDP assess climate response and provide scoring to all listed companies? Can we access the CDP scoring? This will help assess where the company is on their climate management efforts. So yeah, that's also another good question. So any company who respond to CDP, they will, by the scoring deadline, they will receive a score, as I talked about earlier, from D to A, to help companies to identify their position, as we call it, to environmental leadership. So again, when it comes to this assessment itself, you can go to cdp.net and you can find all of the questionnaires, and you can also find the scoring methodology to understand the criteria that we apply to score each of the questions. You can also see the scores of other companies on our CDP website. So if you go to the website, you can scroll down and you can filter by year and by country and industry and so forth. And you can see how other companies are performing. And for the companies who choose to submit publicly, which is quite a few, you can also, if you log into the website, you can view their responses in full, so you can see what other companies are responding. So as I mentioned earlier, last year we had almost 10,000 companies worldwide responding to our platform. So we have companies from all different sectors and industries responding. So there's a lot of good opportunities for benchmarking against the score and for learning purposes as well. So I hope that answers your question. Let me see, Henry, I have one question here that I see that you are open to answer. So Henry, can I address this to you? From what is seen now, how are organizations' structures affected with these requirements? Are there new positions, designations created? Who are these positions?
Okay, thank you, Fred, for the question. So sejauh ini di Indonesia, tentu saja ini merupakan inisiatif yang masih baru. Dan sejauh ini biasanya yang bertanggung jawab yang ada di garda paling depan adalah corporate secretary untuk memimpin proses penyusunan sustainability reporting beserta beragam framework. Tetapi tentu saja ini tidak di semua perusahaan diaplikasikan seperti ini, karena setiap perusahaan punya konteks organisasinya masing-masing. Misalnya bila suatu perusahaan memiliki departemen khusus sustainability, itu biasanya mereka nanti bisa yang bertanggung jawab adalah bagian sustainability tersebut. Misalnya seperti itu. Nah, ini adalah posisi yang berada di garda depan ya dalam implementasi. Tetapi tentu saja untuk memungkinkan implementasi ini terjadi dibutuhkan direksi atau arahan atau delegasi wewenang dari senior level management, di mana BOD di sini juga harus paham tentang apa itu sustainability reporting, frameworknya apa saja, manfaatnya apa saja, regulasinya apa saja, sehingga mereka bisa memberikan wewenang ini kepada tadi tim yang akan mengimplementasikan, yang tadi dipimpin bisa oleh corporate secretary atau bagian sustainability department bila ada bagian khusus tersebut. Nah, setelah itu tentu saja dalam mengumpulkan data, memenuhi permintaan dalam framework, dibutuhkan data-data dari berbagai departemen. Nah, di sini biasanya dibutuhkan pembentukan tim bersama. Jadi kalau isu lingkungan hidup, berarti departemen yang bertanggung jawab untuk lingkungan hidup pun ikut. Untuk data sosial, mungkin kita butuh HR, kita butuh tim CSR, kita butuh tim procurement misalnya, karena mereka yang akan mensuplai data untuk memenuhi permintaan-permintaan yang ada di dalam framework ataupun standar. Nah, kurang lebih inilah cara singkat dan praktik yang umum kita jumpai dari perusahaan yang mulai menyusun sustainability report dengan menggunakan berbagai framework dan standar. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Henry. Yeah, that was a good question and a good answer. Yeah, I completely agree. We have a few more questions. We will reach out to you after the event to answer and to follow up with you to make sure we get all of these answers. But we are running very short on time, so I'll say thank you from me here, and then I will briefly pass it back to my colleague Rini. So Rini, over to you.
Thank you, Fred. Tadi seperti sudah disebutkan oleh Fred, karena waktu kita sudah habis, kami akan tutup sesi tanya-jawab terakhir kita. Bagi pertanyaan yang belum dijawab, akan kami kirimkan semua pertanyaan dan jawaban beserta rekaman dan presentasi hari ini sesudah acara berlangsung. Atas nama tim CDP, kami ucapkan banyak terima kasih atas partisipasi Anda. Mohon maaf jika ada kekurangan. Saya akan kembalikan ke Bu Kinanti untuk menutup acara ini. Selamat siang. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Silakan Ibu Kinanti.
Baik. Selamat siang. Terima kasih kepada pembicara dari CDP atas pemaparannya dan sesi tanya jawab yang telah dilaksanakan. Baik, sebelum kita tutup, sebagaimana telah disampaikan oleh Ibu Rini sebelumnya, sebagai dalam rangkaian webinar hari ini, kita akan memberikan kindly reminder kepada para peserta, kepada Bapak Ibu untuk dapat menghadiri rangkaian seminar ini yang akan diselenggarakan pada tanggal 29 dan 30 Juni yang dengan topik GRI-CDP Advanced Seminar dengan topik Introduction to TCFD and SDGs, dan yang selanjutnya agenda pada bulan Oktober 2021 akan ada dengan tema GRI-CDP Advanced Workshop dengan topik Preparing Corporate Action Plan on TCFD and SDGs. Baik, sebelum kita tutup, kami juga akan menginformasikan bahwa jika ada perubahan tanggal atas pelaksanaan rangkaian seminar tersebut, kami akan informasikan lebih lanjut kepada Bapak dan Ibu. Bapak Ibu yang kami hormati, demikian acara kita pada siang hari ini. Terima kasih atas partisipasi Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, dan mohon maaf jika terdapat kekurangan dalam pelaksanaan acara hari ini. Selamat siang, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Terima
everyone.
kasih. Thank you CDP team.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, CDP team.